Good afternoon and morning for those in the western part of the country. Welcome to the first OSEP Symposium series event, Significant Disproportionality, why this topic is important to all of us. I am Perry Williams with the Office of Special Education Programs, and I will be serving as your moderator for today's event. We are excited about this opportunity to re-engage with you all on a national level regarding the disproportionate assignment of minority children to special education programs. This concern is not new, nor is the requirement for states and LEAs to address the extent to which significant disproportionality is occurring for all racial and ethnic groups. We hope that the information shared today and continued discussions result in thoughtful consideration of how to best support success for all students. Just some housekeeping tips before we get started. Participants will be muted throughout the symposium. We invite you to submit questions in the Ask a Question box under the Q&A tab near the bottom of your screen. We will try to address as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the event. Additional questions may be addressed in subsequent discussion opportunities, which you will receive additional information on next week. In the interest of time, I will be doing abbreviated introductions today. Brief bios of our participants can be found on the symposium site. We had planned for Ruth Ryder, our OSEP Deputy Director, who is currently delegated the duties of Assistant Secretary for Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, to serve some opening remarks with us. But as many of you know, our new Secretary of Education was confirmed yesterday, and today is our first day on the job, and we thought it'd be best that Ruth be at the table with her on her first day. She has asked my colleague, Renee Bradley, to share her remarks.
Thank you, Perry. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first event of our OSEP 2017 Symposia Series. Instead of holding a virtual conference this year, we are launching the Symposia Series as a new effort to connect more, to have more sustained engagement with our stakeholders, and to provide more opportunities for cross-stakeholder interaction. The Symposia Series is designed to meet the following goals: increase awareness of grantees about important topical areas, increase awareness of grantees about resources available to assist states and districts in efforts to improve results for children with disabilities and their families, and to provide opportunities for greater engagement on important issues, both between OSEP staff and OSEP stakeholders and among the different OSEP stakeholder groups. This year, the following symposia will be convened. Today's topic focusing on significant disproportionality, why this topic is important to all of us. On March 22nd, we will focus on creating positive environments for children with disabilities. And on May 17th, the focus will be on displaying our data and conveying our stories. The Symposia Series will be available to all OSEP grantees across our formula and discretionary grants. Each symposium will have 3 components. The first is pre-work materials highlighting useful resources. The second is the 2-hour live event highlighting expert presentations. And approximately 1 week following the event, participants will have the opportunity to engage in a new collaborative space for discussion groups related to the symposium topic. Now for today's topic, significant disproportionality, and why this topic is important to all of us. The final rule on significant disproportionality was published in the Federal Register on December 19, 2016. And became effective on January 18, 2017. We appreciate the many thoughtful comments that we received on the notice of proposed rulemaking, and we discussed all of the comments in the comments and discussion section of the final regulation. States have 18 months to prepare and work with their stakeholders, including their state advisory panels, and make decisions regarding their methodology. The purpose of these final regulations is to promote equity in IDEA. Specifically, the final regulations will help to ensure that states meaningfully identify LEAs with significant disproportionality, and that states assist LEAs ensuring that children with disabilities or those suspecting of having disabilities are properly identified for services, receive necessary services in the least restrictive environment, and are not disproportionately removed from their educational placement by disciplinary removals. These final regulations also address the well-documented and detrimental over-identification of certain students for special education services, with particular concern that over-identification results in children being placed in more restrictive environments and not taught to challenging academic standards. In addition, the final regulation cautions that states and LEAs must continue to carry out requirements related to child find. There are several benefits of the regulations that include increased transparency regarding each state's definition of significant disproportionality, an increased role for stakeholders, including state advisory panels, in determining states' risk ratio thresholds, minimum N sizes, and minimum cell sizes. State review, and if appropriate, revisions of policies, procedures, and practices used in the identification, placement, or discipline of children with disabilities to ensure that the policies, procedures, and practices comply with the requirements of IDEA, and ultimately more appropriate identification, placement, and discipline of children with disabilities. Today you will hear information from our grantees and experts on practices and procedures to address significant disproportionality when it has been identified, including improving the use of data and methodologies, utilizing comprehensive coordinated early intervening services, and improving teacher training and early childhood environments. These presentations are supplemented with the pre-work already posted and the discussion opportunities that will follow. These regulations create an opportunity for states and local agencies to work on a complex issue impacting educational opportunities for a large number of students. Whether it is implementing these new regulations, developing and implementing their SSIP, or the new accountability plans under ESSA, these efforts all benefit from strong, sustained stakeholder engagement. Ruth wanted to take her last few minutes to emphasize the value of stakeholder engagement in addressing significant disproportionality. If we are truly to address the inequities that contribute to significant disproportionality in discipline, identification for and within certain disability categories and placement, the inclusion of a diverse set of stakeholders is crucial. Truly engaging stakeholders in a meaningful way and incorporating their feedback is no small task, but there are resources states and local agencies can use to assist them. OSEP has made significant investments in national technical assistance centers that can support state efforts to implement these regulations and to assist states with ensuring stakeholder engagement. One resource in particular, developed originally by the IDEA partnership and now supported by the National Center on Systemic Improvement, provides a blueprint for stakeholder engagement. Leading by Convening was developed with the input from hundreds of decision makers, implementers, family members, and has been a useful tool used by states to build a diverse stakeholder engagement process. In closing, OSEP is committed to assisting states and other stakeholders in implementing these new regulations as we all work to improve outcomes for children, including children with disabilities. Please note that this symposium is not intended to address the details of your calculation methodology, but rather focus more on supporting LEAs identified significant disproportionality. If you have additional ideas about future support related to significant disproportionality, please send your ideas to significantdisproportionalityrule@ed.gov. Thank you for joining us for our first symposium, and now I will give it back to Perry to introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Renee, for stepping in. Our next speaker will be Michael Gross. Michael is a senior policy advisor in the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. We hope you all had an opportunity to view the Significant Disproportionality 101 video posted in the pre-work site where both Michael and the IDC staff, along with Ruth, provided some basic, more detailed overview information. Today, Michael is going to focus his remarks on highlighting several of the major themes in the regulation. Michael?
Perry, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone out there who's joining us today. As Perry said, I'm not going to torment you by taking you line by line through the regulations or reading to you a list of all of the requirements. And instead, I want to frame the regulation in a way that makes it make sense, I think, for thinking about how to implement it. And so that's why we've called this part the overview. Next slide, please. All right. And the themes that Perry touched upon, the first of which is flexibility. We were under a mandate, as it were, that without boring you with the details of the history, we were trying to create a methodology that was nationally uniform, but at the same time allow states a sensible way to apply the methodology in their specific circumstances. Right? So how do you do that? Are those things in tension with one another? How do you have a national standard that is at the same time locally flexible? And we struggled with that for a great deal of time, and as we built the standard methodology, the flexibilities became clear, and what we came up with, we hope, is a methodology that has flexibility shot throughout it. Next slide, please. Not going to go through, as I said, the nuts and bolts of the methodology, and if you have questions about those, I invite you to look at some of the pre-work materials that are available online. So we'll assume, right, that we can jump right in and talk about setting of risk ratio thresholds and what those are. The first major flexibility, if you want to call it that, the first area of flexibility is the flexibility that the states have when setting their thresholds. You have to set 14 of them, right, because there are 14 categories of analysis for significant disproportionality. And the risk ratio threshold for one need not be the same as the threshold for another. In fact, in some cases, it makes sense for the thresholds to be the same, and in some cases, it doesn't make sense for the thresholds to be the same at all. And so the states have the flexibility to set thresholds that make sense in their circumstances. They can do so by taking into consideration the widely divergent conditions that some of their localities have, whether those are questions of demographics, poverty, special school districts, and so on. The idea, right, is we build in from the jump a way to address the widely different conditions that states are facing. Next slide, please. Now, there's no such thing as a perfect methodology, right? We struggled a great deal with which statistical tool to choose. And there were a number of reasons that we settled on risk ratio. And we're very conscious of the fact that every statistical method has its limitations, and risk ratio has its limitations like the others. It can produce volatile results when you're working with small populations, right? And so how do you prevent the methodology from producing results that don't really signify? And that the answer is, well, you exclude certain small populations from the analysis in the first place. And you do that by setting minimum cell sizes and minimum N sizes, the top and the bottom of the risk ratio fraction, respectively. And so when a population is too small to measure, right, you don't do the significant disproportionality analysis for that category of analysis. And the states have flexibility where to set the minimum cell sizes. If I'm in the panhandle of Nebraska, I'm going to have one set of considerations because most of my school districts are quite rural. If I'm in downtown Chicago, it's another question entirely. Right? The flexibility that we have for minimum cell and N sizes addresses another need as well, right? If you are eliminating this problem of volatility, you're eliminating the idea that you can get a result of significant disproportionality because one or two families have moved into the district. Right? A small change in the population is not going to produce a large change in risk ratio. Next slide, please. Another way to address the question of small populations, right, is that while the state is required to analyze, for significant disproportionality every year, to do a risk ratio calculation every year, the determination of whether significant disproportionality exists doesn't have to be made every year. It may be made after 1 or 2 or 3 years prior. And looking at that data, we can say, all right, well, last year was just a blip. We're back down below the risk ratio threshold now. There's no point, right, in assigning a determination of significant disproportionality every year. That was a statistical anomaly, right? This flexibility also allows us to take into consideration the realistically long time that's required for systematic change. If I've made a systematic change in my processes and procedures in an attempt to address significant disproportionality, I want to give it time to work. Next slide, please. In that same vein, right, if a state and a district have put into place a fix, a change, and you want to give it time to work, if it's working, why interrupt, right? What we call the reasonable progress flexibility, right? That the state, at its option, does not have to determine that there is significant disproportionality in an LEA if for the 2 prior consecutive years the risk ratio is coming down, even if it's above the risk ratio threshold. Again, why interrupt something that's working? Right? So from stem to stern, again, we're trying to get the idea of flexibility into how you make this work as a practical matter on the ground. And that brings me to the last question of flexibility. Next slide, please. Timing. Renee mentioned this in her introduction. Yes, the regulations are effective now. That means the Code of Federal Regulations has changed. But states don't have to come into compliance. States don't have to start using the standard methodology until July 1, 2018, the thinking being that this gives you enough time to set all your risk ratio thresholds, your N sizes, your cell sizes, to hold your consultations, and then be prepared to do this 18 months hence. Next slide. That should cover flexibility. The second big theme is one of reasonableness. And this is related. Everything that the state is selecting, risk ratio thresholds, minimum cell sizes, N sizes, progress, is all framed in terms of reasonableness, right? It should guide all of the determinations that you make. If you want a definition, it's a reasonableness in all the circumstances. Take into consideration all of the relevant facts and circumstances, racial and ethnic composition, enrollment demographics, conditions correlated with disability when deciding on the settings for your standard methodology. Next slide, and next slide again. Actually, I think I jumped forward. We have given you some help in that, in the selection of reasonable values. If you look at the regulation, you'll see that we have written that a minimum cell size of no greater than 10 and a minimum n size of no greater than 30 are presumptively reasonable, right? If that suits your statistical needs, you don't have a whole lot more to do, right? If you choose a number larger than 10 for the cell size or larger than 30 for the n size, then we may have a conversation about why those are reasonable in the circumstances. But at those values or below that value, not necessary. Right? So again, reasonableness, if you want to think of it as a form of flexibility, it's the second large characteristic or theme in the regulations. So next slide, please. And then the final, change gears. This comprehensive CEIS, this is not a methodological question. This is not something that has to do with the standard methodology. Next slide, please. The importance here, right, is that the remedy has been expanded. That under the prior rules, right, CEIS could not be used to serve children with disabilities or preschool children aged 3 to 5. Now they can. So that, we think, goes a long way to lessening the concern about moving 15% of your IDEA Part B set-aside budget, and is really one of the significant changes and themes in the regulation. I'm getting toward the end of my time, so I'm going to wrap it up and do not want to keep you longer than is necessary. One important limitation for comprehensive CEIS, and that is it has to be targeted to address the factors that contribute to the significant disproportionality in the first place, whether that's a lack of access to instruction or diagnostic screening, economic, cultural, linguistic barriers to appropriate identification and placement, inappropriate use of disciplinary removals, differences in achievement, etc. The tool is a directed tool, right? How to get at the factors contributing to the significant disproportionality that's been identified. Right? So that's a quick overview of the major themes. I will take my seat, and Perry will come back and bring you your next speaker. Thank you very much for your attention. It's much appreciated.
Thank you very much, Michael. Our next presentation will be a panel from our OSEP-funded IDEA Data Center, also known as IDC. Tom Munk and Nancy Harrell will talk about the Success Gap tool and how it can be used to identify the school and district level factors contributing to significant disproportionality. Tom and Nancy.
Hi, I'm Tom Munk from the IDEA Data Center. Nancy and I are going to talk today about the new regulations and how they emphasize the factors that contribute to significant disproportionalities, about IDC's Success Gaps toolkit that can help districts to address that, about how IDC has supported states and districts in using the Success Gaps tools and their significant disproportionality work over the last few years. And we will have links to other resources that can support states in addressing significant disproportionality. Next slide, please. Imagine you're in a district that's been identified with significant disproportionality. Perhaps one group of children in your district is more likely than others to be identified for special education. Perhaps one racial ethnic group in your district is more likely to be identified in a specific special education category. Or one group is more likely to spend time outside the regular classroom or one group of students is more likely than other groups to be suspended or expelled. Significant disproportionality is easy to identify mathematically, but its meaning can be a little bit harder to unravel, and that's what we want to talk about. For example, the new regulations recognize that sometimes overrepresentation of one group of students may actually represent a problematic under-identification of another group of students. Because of challenges like these, the new regulations require that when a state determines that significant disproportionality is occurring in a local education agency, that LEA must identify and address the factors contributing to the significant disproportionality. We take that requirement very seriously. In fact, we've been working on it for the last few years at the IDA Data Center. This makes sense because addressing the issues requires first understanding the issues, which can be complex. Next slide. The regulations themselves list some of the possible factors that contribute to significant disproportionality: a lack of access to scientifically based instruction, economic, cultural, or linguistic barriers to appropriate identification or placement in particular educational settings, inappropriate use of disciplinary removals, lack of access to appropriate diagnostic screenings, differences in academic achievement levels, and policies, practices, or procedures that contribute to significant disproportionality. These are just some of the factors that might contribute to significant disproportionality in your LEA. Thinking about those factors that are listed, how many of these would be identified in an LEA's typical review of policies, procedures, and practices? At IDC, we think of policies and procedures as mostly found on paper, while practices are found in actual interactions between staff and students. Do current LEA reviews actually get to the practice level? To what depth? Next slide, please. One resource for helping LEAs identify the factors that may contribute to significant disproportionality is the Success Gaps Toolkit. The toolkit provides a process and resources needed to find the factors leading to success gaps among groups of students. But notice now we're talking about success gaps, not significant disproportionality. So let me clarify that a little bit. What do we mean by success gaps? Next slide, please. We define a success gap very simply as a gap in educational outcomes between different groups of students. You can see that on the graphic. Success gaps can occur for any groups of students and may be in many areas, such as graduation rates, reading proficiency, course placement. Significant disproportionality is just one example of a success gap. Significant disproportionality and other success gaps suggest that some groups of children in the school or district may not be receiving equitable educational opportunities. The significant disproportionalities are frequently related to these other kinds of success gaps, resulting in poor outcomes or lack of success for students in the affected groups. Next slide, please. IDC's Success Gap Toolkit is based on research that identifies the common elements that improve educational outcomes for all students. It's possible to improve achievement or outcomes for certain subgroups of students with disabilities in a district or school if these students have equitable access to appropriate and high-quality educational programs. Embedded in the Success Gaps Toolkit is an idea about what that means. High-quality education, as you see on the screen, is data-based. It's responsive to the cultures that students and families bring into the schools. It's built on the base of a high-quality core instructional program for all students. It includes universal screening and frequent progress monitoring as part of a multi-tiered system of support. If all of these elements are not equally available to all groups of students, one result might be significant disproportionality or other success gaps. I'll turn it over now to my colleague, Nancy O'Hara.
Thank you, Tom. Good afternoon. Success gaps that do not start, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. Success gaps toolkit does not identify your disproportionality. That happens before you want to use the toolkit. But once you know what your significant disproportionality is, then it's time to think about the toolkit as one of the resources you can use to begin to identify some of the factors. And so the Success Gaps Toolkit contains the white paper and the rubric around which the rest of the toolkit is built. It's been newly revised to be more inclusive of preschool, as well as updated with language from Every Student Succeeds Act. It describes in the toolkit a process to consider reviewing practices that may be the root causes of significant disproportionality. It contains all the resources you would need to use the process. It'll have agendas, PowerPoints, videos, all sorts of resources so that you can use a process. And the toolkit provides the supports that your district or your school leaders need to lead this work. What you might have noticed on the previous slide that Tom showed you was that district leadership and parent engagement are not included in those 5 factors, yet we all know that those are critical in school success, in achieving school success. Within this toolkit, we have built those in. So leadership is built right into it by the district leaders or the school leaders facilitating the toolkit. Parent engagement was in each of the 5 sections of the rubric rather than a separate standalone item. Next slide, please. Once you have identified a success gap, then you can use the toolkit. And the first thing you want to do is to form a local stakeholder team to focus on your significant disproportionality. As you begin to form your team, it's very important to know what your focus is. What was your area of significant disproportionality or areas? Is it about white students being over-identified in autism? Is it about Hispanic students who are placed in more restrictive environments, or any of these other factors? But you want to know what your focus group is as you form your team, because on your team, you want to have representatives that are impacted by the significant disproportionality. So you want to think about family members that are represented by the group that is disproportionate. You want to think about your general and special ed staff and support staff that work with the students who may be impacted by the significant disproportionality as well. And you also want to think about community members. Who are the community members that also have information and knowledge about this particular group? Next slide, please. Then, once you have a team, you use the toolkit to go through this process. And the toolkit will give you all the materials you need, and it will describe the process. But this is where the leadership really comes into play, because the leadership is going to identify and set aside time to commit to this process. It is multiple meetings. It won't happen in 2 hours. You're not going to find the root cause of your significant disproportionality in 2 hours and think you've solved the problems of the world. It is going to be a commitment of time. The other part that the leadership is so critical to is it has to be a safe and honest environment. We are talking about some sensitive topics that people can get very excited about or offended by, and so it is important that the environment is very safe for the individuals to honestly talk about what they see as their responses to the rubric, and you work towards a consensus of your group. That's why it's so important to have the variety of team members as well as this kind of welcoming and safe environment. Certainly then you disaggregate the data, and you keep disaggregating the data. You keep digging deeper, and through the process you'll document decisions that you're making as a team, why you made that decision, so you document the evidence. Once you've gone through that rubric, all 5 of the sections that we talked about, then you'll have some priorities. So you have some very solid reasons why that may be contributing to those factors that are causing significant disproportionality. And then you can develop a plan of action to address your significant disproportionality. Next slide. So when it all works right, when significant disproportionality goes away, you are less likely to have success gaps and more likely to have education success. And this is the toolkit, which we'll give you the resource for at the end. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk for a few minutes now about how states have been using the success gaps tools and materials, as well as how IDC has supported some of those states to use these. And just as a reminder, success gaps are really designed for use at the district and the school level, but states can support that use. So one example is it can be used in conjunction with self-assessments or monitoring protocols that states are already doing. Most states already have in their processes for significant disproportionality a self-assessment review, a monitoring protocol they use, and that you can add the success gaps materials to that and really get to the practices level. I would ask you the question, as I believe Tom asked, does your self-assessment or your monitoring protocol really get to the practices of what's happening in your district? And so we think that the success gaps materials bring that level of additional information to a review and a policy. There are also multiple states that already have used the multiple years of data before they identify significant disproportionality, as the new regulations specifically allow now. But those that have already been doing that have used the success gaps materials with districts that may be in years 1 and 2 of data not yet identified by the multiple year definition, but states have used the success gaps materials proactively to kind of say, take a look at what's happening. You're getting close to meeting the threshold that the state has set for the number of years the state has set. So use the success gaps materials as kind of a proactive, preventative way to think about it so that you don't get to the label of significant disproportionality. The other way that we've seen states use the materials is if they do identify significant disproportionality, then one of the things they do is require their districts to create an action plan to address significant disproportionality. And the success gaps materials are a great way to start reviewing your issue, your significant disproportionality, get to the root cause, and then develop the action plan to address significant disproportionality. Next slide, please. So IDC has worked with states and can help states kind of think about it. So one of the first things you have to think about as you look at this is building state capacity. States have to be able to, the toolkit works with all the areas of significant disproportionality as we go forward. Could you do the next slide, please? So we're going to start with state capacity building. Before a state can expect a district to use our toolkit, state staff must have the understanding of significant disproportionality, what the toolkit and the process requires for fidelity, and what the toolkit does not do, as well as some experience in using the materials so they can support the districts. IDC can work with state staff to learn about significant disproportionality and how to use the toolkit. We've been doing some of that work with a few states already. States also, as we know, have multiple ways of handling significant disproportionality. There's been lots of flexibility. And many states now, because of new regulations, are really starting to rethink and revise their processes and procedures. IDC staff can work with states to think about how they're revising some of these processes or procedures and how the toolkit for success gaps could be a part of some of those revised processes. The new regulations require a lot of stakeholder input, as we all know and as we've heard. IDC has been helping a few states seek to form stakeholder groups and provide information about significant disproportionality in their input. And one of the comments we've heard a lot from some of those stakeholder groups has been, well, if we use multiple years of data, then we feel like we're letting districts get away with something if we wait 3 years, and there's disproportionality happening that we're not addressing. And so several stakeholder groups have asked for a process that districts could be required to do prior to being identified. Kind of as I said a few minutes ago, in those years before you meet the threshold for the defined number of years, if you're at year 1 or 2, then is there a process? And the Success Gaps Toolkit is one of those processes that could certainly be used to address some of that. Next slide, please. So as we said, the toolkit is really designed at the district and school level. So building that district or school capacity to review and address the factors that cause significant disproportionality. And that's something that we've been looking at and working with a few states, and it's something we can do as we move forward. So one of the things is states often like to look at creating a forum for significant disproportionality when they've identified a group of districts as having significant disproportionality. One of the practices that have already been in place with them is to convene those districts in a type of forum, bring those LEAs together, and receive information about significant disproportionality and how to address it. The Success Gaps Toolkit is a great facilitator of a conversation with LEA teams when they come, if they bring a team. So we think that that's a great use of the toolkit, and we have helped some states plan forums that way. The challenge often, however, in bringing together as a forum at the state level is you can't always get districts to bring the number of team members and the desired team members. So if you'll remember a few slides back, we really talked very specifically about how critical the team makeup is for using the Success Gaps materials. So one of the things that is probably important is that the district learns about the success gaps at a forum, and they're facilitated to learn to use it, but then the expectation is they would go back to their district to really go through the process with fidelity and think about it, use the toolkit in depth so that they can really get to some of the root causes or the factors that may be contributing to significant disproportionality. And in that case, it's probably important that people from the state staff understand and are also able to help facilitate, coach, give the district support in order to use the toolkit. Sometimes an LEA wants to work with a particular school or region of schools. So we've talked about how the state can help the LEAs. Sometimes when it gets back to the LEA level and they start to look at their data in more detail, they look that there's a school or a cluster of schools that tend to be at the root of some of the data that may be causing some of the significant disproportionality. So they may ask a group of schools or a few schools to use the success gap at the school level and really look at their particular school rather than at a district-wide view. So that's another use for more in-depth work. And then sometimes when a district may have had continuing significant disproportionality with little or no improvement, then the state really wants to work more closely with a particular district. And so they could use the Success Gaps materials, and we have worked with a couple of states to do this, focusing on a particular district. So that district created a team. The state and the district worked together, going through the Success Gaps material to really identify where are some of the challenges as it relates to significant disproportionality, what are some of those factors, and how can we address those. One state we know that we worked with had a forum for all their districts, as I've described, and then they offered districts kind of on a first-come, first-served basis. If you would like to work more closely with the state and IDC to do some in-depth work, then they gave them that opportunity. They kind of made it sound like a great opportunity to work more closely for some really direct TA to address significant disproportionality. And several of their districts took advantage of it, and the state and IDC have worked closely with one to take the work they already did with the Success Gaps rubric and really dig down and identify what their issues were. And I'm going to give you one more example of work within a state and a district. And in a particular state that we've done some work with the Success Gaps, one district was there and had been identified with significant disproportionality for several years prior to the state introducing the Success Gaps as part of their process. And they convened a state forum of multiple districts, and this particular district that had been there a number of years, kind of some of their background, they were pretty much their disproportionality was the discipline of black students. Their district was almost all black majority students, and the faculty was also almost all black majority students. So they were using the rubric, and they thought before they started in the Success Gaps materials, they knew what their issues were going to be. In fact, they came to the table prior to the work and said, here's what our root cause is. Here, we know what it is. And that was one of the root causes, but when they actually went through the rubric and started to think about it honestly, they found out that another one of their issues was about cultural responsiveness. Now, they were surprised themselves because they felt like because it was a majority black district, majority black staff, culture things were not the issue there. What they found out, it was the culture related to poverty that was the real issue, because the faculty, although of the same race, ethnicity as the students for the most part, the faculty that are paid on teacher's salary in this very poor community were the middle class of the community, and many, many of the students that were having all these discipline issues were very low income, very impoverished students. So it was just kind of an eye-opening to that district to think about it that way. And they are making improvement. I will say that that district has not resolved all of their significant disproportionality yet, but for the last 2 years they have brought the numbers down. And with the new flexibilities, regulations, it's very possible in the future, even though they haven't gone below the state's threshold, they could be approaching the flexibility requirements with the new regulations as they move forward. Next slide, please. So as we start to wrap up and talking about the Success Gaps materials, just want to talk to you about a few resources. These are the resources that are available to you from education, from US Ed, the new regulations, and we've made all these links when the PowerPoints become available. So these are all links that when you are able to get to the PowerPoints. So it's, of course, to the new regulations, the fact sheet on equity and IDEA, which links you to other resources as well as Memo 0809 on coordinated early intervening services. It probably will need some tweaks in the future, but it is mentioned multiple times in the comments to the regulations, and so we felt like it was an important resource. Next slide. So these are resources that IDC has for determining significant disproportionality, and several of these, just as I'm talking about them, are undergoing revisions because of the new regulations. But they are out there now and will be adapted soon. So it's the methods for assessing racial and ethnic disproportionality. in special ed. It was a technical assistance guide, as well as a spreadsheet that you can use to calculate disproportionality. And the toolkit that we've been talking about, the IDC Success Gaps Toolkit, is the link at the bottom of the page. And one more, please. Some additional resources related to significant disproportionality and or CEIS that are available on a variety of TA Center websites include the CEIS resources step by step. It's posted on the Cipher website, but it is a document that walks you through and leads you to a variety of resources in all steps of identifying districts who may be required to provide CEIS or voluntarily providing CEIS. There's a quick reference guide on CEIS, the MOE reduction eligibility decision tree and worksheet as it interacts with CEIS, the Navigating CEIS white paper. IDA has a training module. They have multiple data training modules, and the one, module 3, is about the May data submission, which is where the MOE CEIS data is submitted. There's also 618 data edit check tools for the MOE CEIS. And finally, of course, the eMaps user guide is another resource for CEIS. Next slide. And that's it. So please, all of this information you can find from the IDC website at idadata.org. Thank you.
Thank you both, Nancy and Tom. Next, we will hear from Dr. Eddie Fergus. Eddie is an assistant professor at NYU and a well-recognized expert in supporting states and school districts that have been identified with significant disproportionality. Based on his work around the country, Eddie will focus on how schools are utilizing comprehensive coordinated early intervening services to address significant disproportionality. Eddie's presentation will build on Tom and Nancy's presentations in terms of it goes the next step in looking at how schools, again, are utilizing, school districts are utilizing their CEIS funds.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning for colleagues out way on the West Coast. Thank you all for stealing the time to actually engage in this conversation around disproportionality. It's a rare opportunity for us to actually get a great deal of clarity and for us to come together as a community of practitioners. So what I'm going to first talk about is, obviously, it's really setting the stage in terms of the importance of CEIS plans, funding, and the plans that are related to it. And for me, this really draws from the last 15 years of work, and in particular working with nearly 70 school districts on disproportionality. Next slide, please. So I'm going to first sort of highlight sort of one of the core sort of policy context around this and the questions. You know, what I'm actually going to talk through is a paper that I actually is under current review right now for a journal that really pays attention to this conversation of, so what are we learning from CEIS plans as they have been part of the landscape of our work since 2004's reauthorization of IDEA. If you could advance, please. So as we know that there is a reality around the policy context, which is that districts that are cited for SIGDIS or significant disproportionality are required to allot up to 15% of their Part B funds to address these issues. Next, please. So what became an imperative, obvious, policy to practice question is, how are school districts translating the guidance on CEIS funds utilization into strategies for remedying racial ethnic disproportionality? Next, please. So I will focus on actually secondary data that was collected as part of a project with the State Education Department between 2011 and 2013. Next slide, please. And the sample that I'm drawing from here is actually a sample of around 12 school districts that were cited for significant disproportionality. These districts were also receiving specialized target technical assistance in the form of a grant and as well as external consultants. And as well as these districts also participated in a 4-part process that involved a self-review, root cause analysis, and identification of remedy areas. Next slide, please. So these next two slides actually just give a quick snapshot of these districts, the percentage of their racial ethnic enrollment, their percentage of free and reduced lunch student eligibility, and obviously the type of significant disproportionality citation. Next slide, please. So as you can see that there's a complete range of school districts that were being cited by State Education Department for significant disproportionality. So what did we learn? Next slide, please. Next slide. So this is a quick snapshot of some of the things that I learned in the review of this data. There are core areas that cut across all of these different districts in terms of what they outline in their CIS plans. First column you'll see is RTI, response to intervention. This next column is PBIS, so Positive Behavior Intervention Systems, and MTSS. The next column is Equity Consultant CRE training. CRE stands for Culturally Responsive Education Training. Next column is Data Consultant or Systems. Next column is Specific Interventions. And then lastly, equity goals, or in broadest sense, equity sort of trajectory is part of the CIS plans. Now I'm going to walk through sort of what each one actually sort of emerged as within each one of these districts. Next, please. So one of the first things, you can advance, is that what cut across everyone was all of these LEAs, the school districts, is that they were following the policy provisions that are built into the utilization of CIS funds and the plans that they developed. So there was a close attention to the utilization of the funds to support professional development and intervention supports, particularly in areas like RTI, PBIS, MTSS, data consultant, and as well as culturally responsive education consultant or training. Advance, please. And obviously these are a range of the types of things that were actually in these 12 districts in their CIS plans. As you can see that they range from convenings to help build an RTI framework to the actual nuts and bolts of actually developing an RTI framework, trainings that were specific, specifically done by a variety of providers, for example, Solution Tree, literacy training for special ed and general education teachers. In some of those plans, some of these types of trainings, one of the elements that was built in was a designation that these trainings should happen as with special ed and general education teachers together in order to begin dissolving some of the barriers that existed amongst these groups. Next slide, please. More around sort of the types of policy provisions that also emerged were when we're in looking at their PBIS, MTSS activities. They similarly focus on training teachers on new systems and on specific interventions such as peace builders. In two specific districts, the PBIS, MTSS activities involve trainings on crisis prevention and legal requirements surrounding suspension. In addition, another component that LEAs paid close attention to in terms of following policy provisions was around the utilization of consultants around providing trainings specific to issues around culture, and particularly around culturally responsive education, as well as data systems or analysis that were necessary in order to improve a school district's capacity to continuously look at disproportionality versus it being simply something that's annotated from the state, but it's not a continuous element of their improvement data analysis over time. Next. However, one of the things that in my examination around these CIS plans and a concern that emerged was that the utilization of these external consultants, particularly those that pay attention to culturally responsive topics, is the tendency of these activities to appear in these plans as one-time activities without any explicit development around institutionalizing a specific set of equity goals. So those school districts were identifying that they had process and policy and practice gaps that were existing. In those moments where they were engaging consultants around culturally responsive topics, they appeared to be one-off set of activities and or disconnected from the broader set of areas that they identified in their CIS plans. On the other hand, the data analysis or systems consultancy that appeared in these CIS plans actually suggests that there could be a potential of how these school districts were actually embedding into their their work plans and a close attention to disproportionality as one of those analysis areas that is imperative for them to pay attention to how they actually do their practice. Next slide, please. Another area that these districts also showed up was the nature to which there was how the nature of how they paid attention to fidelity. So those CIS plans may only provide a window into how districts are interpreting the guidance provided by state education departments on funding expenditures regarding disproportionality. They do begin to give some indication as to whether this initial form of plan could yield direct and or indirect effect on disproportionality. A concern that emerged in looking at these plans was the degree to which the absence of information regarding professional development or intervention quality and or fidelity monitoring actually may result in these activities also being one-offs or one-time activities. Later on, I will talk a little bit about a set of recommendations I have around what state education departments and school districts can do to really improve to ensure that what they're building into their CIS plans actually has longevity. Next, please. The next set of findings really speak to the degree to which the absence of language around equity in CIS plans. Though the identification of patterns of racial ethnic disproportionality in special education may direct school districts to consider race-based issues in their policies, practices, and procedures, it has not directed districts to consider adopting equity-guided goals. As Nancy already highlighted, that the engagement around discussions of addressing significant disproportionality require a close attention to understanding that there is a racialized issue that's emerging in relation to the disproportionate representation. Though there may be identification through this root cause process in which school districts actually have gaps existing within their systems, there also has to be an understanding as to if these gaps are existing in systems, that means that they're impacting everyone within the system. But the broader question is, why is it disproportionately affecting certain groups of kids? And so that necessitates a closer attention to what are some equity-based issues that have to be tackled. So despite the low incidence of equity goals or activity identified in these CIS plans, the districts in which explicit language on equity goals appeared did suggest a level to which district commitment to addressing racial ethnic disproportionality could actually be a systemic strategy versus a compartmentalized singular policies, practices, or procedures, which is the long-term concern around if there isn't a clear definition around equity that school districts are actually doing, the remedies that are actually enacted within school districts will be singular and or one-time set of activities. So the next slide, you'll see an example of one of the school districts, one of the 12 school districts that actually adopted, had a school board adopted policy that included explicit language around equity. And in particular, they defined equity, they included in their definition of equity 3 major components. One of them, the first one being that there is an explicit understanding of a numerical goal, meaning that they're trying to close something, reduce something, or improve an area. Secondly, they outline the degree to which there is a close attention to access and opportunity being the guiding practice and procedural frameworks that are necessary for improving disproportionality. And then lastly, their last component of their equity definition, which is an attention to the types of culture and beliefs that we want to promote, and also the culture and beliefs that are the ones that are setting the stage for disproportionality being rationalized as an appropriate outcome to actually exist. So that attention, this type of definition, is something that I'm starting to see in a lot more school districts, particularly school districts that I'm working with, to ensure that they are constantly paying attention to those 3 prongs of equity. Next slide, please. Lastly, I will mention in terms of sort of some of the key points is that there's a need for us to make sure that these CIS plans that state education departments are helping to support school districts around and school districts as they are developing them to ensure that they're research-based, as well as ensuring that there is that within that work that there is a closer attention to the degree to which equity is defined by school districts in terms of how they not only understand that they have gaps in their systems, but also what are the core issues that have led to those gaps being disproportionately affecting certain groups of kids. Next slide, please. And another component is understanding sort of the potential around another role that I see also that that specifically state education departments can play in terms of CIS plans is a greater attention in terms of making sure that there's quality around those plans. School districts are walking into an arena where there may not be a great deal of understanding across the board in terms of what are the specific types of systems, practices, and policies that are implicated in this issue. And state education departments can play a significant role in really helping to outline the types of guidance on the process of examining how disproportionality is emerging. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'm going to talk about sort of what's the nature of the recommendation, particularly around aligning CIS plans and root cause approach, which Nancy and Tom just talked specifically around in terms of the IDC example. So root cause processes, which have been existing for quite some time here within this landscape of disproportionality, and you see a range of tools that are continuously existing throughout the country. And these are examples. The four there, once you have access to the PowerPoint, these are hyperlinks that you can connect to the various types of examples of doing root cause analysis. What's important is that there is a close attention to the fidelity of the process. It is not, each one of these processes go beyond what many school districts consider, this looks like the 5 whys process, but in actuality, all of these represents a much more robust, evidence-based approach to really identifying what are some of the core causes that are playing a role of significant disproportionality. Next slide, please. And then lastly, the last component in terms of my recommendation around ensuring that there's alignment between CIS plans and root cause process is that there is a close attention to what it actually means for a CIS plan to be mapped onto what actually came out of the root cause analysis. You have various examples across the country in which that is occurring. California is one particular example that's actually been doing it. It's a state that I've been working with. And then also another component that also requires close attention around the comprehensive CIS plans and their alignment with root cause process is the degree to which that there is an infusion around, or an infusion of using the framework from the National Implementation Research Network that really outlines for many types of organizations the importance of implementation science be embedded in the manner in which we not only identify sort of an issue, but also how we go about remedying and as well as monitoring the wellness to which we're actually, we should be expecting effect as a result of the plans that we have developed. And with that, thank you.
Thank you, Eddie. I'm sure that bringing your real-life examples to this discussion is helpful to all of our participants. We appreciate you. Before we move on, several participants have asked about the idea.ed.gov site being down. This is an unfortunate glitch that we are working to address as soon as possible. In the meantime, resources for the symposium can be accessed through the OSEP ideas.work.org site, and the materials Nancy and Tom mentioned can also be found at ideadata.org. Now, we're going to share 2 short video examples from our Part D funded programs that can assist states and local agencies in addressing significant disproportionality, and also as examples of how our Part D investments can contribute to this effort. Our first video is from Phil Strain, a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, who will describe the Pyramid Project, a strategy to provide alternatives to suspension and expulsion in early childhood settings. Our second video is from Kent McIntosh, a professor at the University of Oregon, who will share a promising way to increase the motivation of teachers and service providers for addressing discipline disproportionality through the use of data. Additional information on both of these strategies are available in the pre-work resources.
Hello, this is Phil Strain from the University of Colorado at Denver, and it's my pleasure to be with you today to tell you a little bit about the Pyramid Equity Project and how it has been designed to address disproportionality in discipline practices at the early childhood level. As we've all been made painfully aware in the last few years, there are totally unacceptable levels of suspension and expulsion of young children from early childhood settings. And we also know that there are alarming racial and gender disproportionalities in the implementation of suspension and expulsion as well. Briefly, today I want to share with you how the Pyramid Equity Project, or PEP, is designed to address the concerns around suspension and expulsion. It has been said that the way one defines a problem will determine in substantial measure the strategies used to solve it. I guess the corollary of that is that if you get the definition wrong, you'll never come up with the right solution. So I want to really focus on how we define the concepts and the strategies around suspension and expulsion in our project. First of all, suspension and expulsion are behaviors engaged in by adults. I guess that's obvious at one level. But what's perhaps not so obvious is that adult behavior change, therefore, as well as adult thinking change and adult feeling change, has to be a primary target if we're going to solve the issues around suspension and expulsion. To be sure, child challenging behavior often precedes adult action around suspension and expulsion. But child behavior change alone is not the necessary or sufficient solution. Second, it's important to recognize that the adult behavior change that we seek is one that has to be encouraged and sanctioned and intensively supported by service delivery systems. Service delivery systems that first establish a leadership team that is committed to better, more efficacious, and more just and equitable discipline practices. This is one of those cases where practitioners acting alone is not sufficient. Systemic change is what is necessary. Third, it's important to recognize that the core evidence-based discipline practices that we promote in the Pyramid Equity Project are, not surprisingly, based upon the pyramid model for the social and emotional development of young children and infants for that matter. This pyramid model has been demonstrated to be effective in multiple randomized controlled trials. Moreover, many of the discrete teaching practices that are the heart and soul of this tiered support model have been demonstrated to be effective in literally hundreds of other experimental studies. Moreover, in 2016, my colleagues and I here in Colorado demonstrated that the implementation of the pyramid model can reduce suspension and expulsion on a statewide level here in Colorado by more than 50%. And I would refer you to challengingbehavior.org for more information on the pyramid model and its implementation components. One of those other components that's important to talk about in this context is our use of a fidelity measure, the Teaching Pyramid Observation Tool, which allows us to assess the implementation of, if you will, the independent variable at the individual classroom level. Supplementing the pyramid model, because of the significant racial and gender disparities and the incidence of suspension and expulsion, the PEP project is also developing materials and strategies to address implicit bias and to increase the use of culturally responsive practices in our demonstration model sites. Fourth, I want to emphasize that the Pyramid Equity Project recognizes that both suspension and expulsion are things that happen more often when there is a disconnect between service providers and adult family members. Therefore, another key component of the support that we provide to programs is around developing positive and reciprocally helpful relationships between service providers and adult family members. Fifth, we believe that it is essential that service delivery programs, if they're going to be successful in eliminating suspension and expulsion and using more research-based and effective discipline practices, they must be utilizing data on the incidence of challenging behavior and responses to those challenging behaviors on a regular basis. Why is that the case? It's the case because the mere absence of suspension and expulsion does not equate to a quality service delivery program at the early childhood level, especially for children with persistent and serious challenging behavior. Therefore, we have developed a data system that we call the Behavior Incident Report that provides an in-depth analysis in real time of individual challenging behavior and the discipline events surrounding those challenging behavior events. And data from this system then allows program leaders to make important strategic decisions about where to put their internal personnel development resources, how to identify in a cost-efficient and rapid fashion the children who may need more intensive support, and how to track and intervene on disproportionate practices around discipline specific to race and gender. This data system, the Behavior Incident Report, because of its nature and how it is utilized, also allows service delivery programs to track changes in the competencies of staff, in the behavior of children, as well as to track disproportionality across time. Well, it's time for me to wrap up. And let me wrap up with this thought. And that is that neither suspension or expulsion are evidence-based practices, at least at the early childhood level. To the contrary, the evidence suggests that these are racially discriminatory practices in their utilization, that they ironically remove the children most in need of instruction from that instruction, and that they sabotage essential and pivotal relationships with adult family members. That is why the overarching aim of the Pyramid Equity Project is not just to reduce suspension and expulsions, but to take them to zero, and to demonstrate that early childhood programs and the parents and the children in those programs can all be successful when programs and practitioners utilize evidence-based discipline practices to a high degree of fidelity. I thank you for this time to provide a brief introduction to the Pyramid Equity Project, and look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Disproportionality in school discipline by race, ethnicity, or disability is such a big problem in education today that it can seem insurmountable to teachers. And that leads even the most caring educators at a total loss for what to do. Here we are being asked to solve a problem that's bigger than schools. But at the same time, who better to solve that problem than teachers? Now here's how we used to try to motivate educators to tackle this problem. We'd simply share their data showing the extent of discipline disproportionalities. So we'd show a graph showing data that black or African American students are over 2.5 times more likely to be sent to the office than white students. The idea is to shock people into action, create this cognitive dissonance between what's happening and what our values are. But the problem is it usually has the opposite effect: defensiveness about the data or just plain old despair. What we're doing now is to use data a little bit differently. Our research is showing that disproportionality is not consistent across all situations. In some specific situations, staff discipline decisions are perfectly equitable across groups, but other situations are more vulnerable to the effects of implicit bias in our discipline decisions. Our national data from over 6,000 schools in 48 states show that disproportionality is more likely for subjective problem behaviors, such as the 3 Ds of defiance, disrespect, and disruption, in the classroom and hallways, and in the afternoons. However, each school might have different patterns. If we have discipline data systems that allow us to disaggregate patterns of referrals, we can use our discipline data to identify areas of equity, where things are going well, where we can build on, and areas of disproportionality, where we can use strategies that are most likely to enhance equity where it's most needed. Now let me give you an example from a real partnering school. The school had perfect equity in attendance referrals, but a specific pattern of inequity in discipline referrals. Using the Discipline Data Guide, one of the free equity resources from the OSEP Center on Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, the school team used their data system, the School-Wide Information System, or SWIS, to instantly calculate separate graphs by race to find differences. The team found that their strongest disproportionality was in issuing referrals to black students for a specific situation: defiance in the classroom in the first 30 minutes of the school day. Now, all of a sudden, this huge societal problem turns into a scenario where we can use our good teaching strategies to improve outcomes. So they came up with a 3-point plan. Number 1, have food available for any student who came to school hungry. Number 2, greet all students at the door by name and say something positive on their way in. And number 3, start with easy review work before moving on into teaching new or more difficult academic skills. So what's needed to do this? Number 1, a discipline data system that allows teachers and administrators to look at graphs of referrals and suspensions disaggregated by the student group of interest, whether that's race, ethnicity, language status, disability. And then also training and ongoing coaching in clear steps for 1, identifying disparities, 2, identifying those specific situations that are vulnerable to implicit bias, number 3, selecting strategies that are most likely to work and implementing them well, and number 4, monitoring effectiveness of the plan. Now, a free guide for this process is available at the equity page on the pbis.org website, along with other resource guides on engaging instruction, policy changes, and cultural responsiveness of school behavior support systems.
Welcome back live. Thank you, both Phil and Kent. They will be available in the Q&A session if you have specific questions for either of them. Now I'm going to ask Eddie to join us again to share another brief practice example of a district that is moving in the right direction, and then we will move to the Q&A session. Eddie.
Thank you. So this short example I'm going to give is from one of the many school districts that I have worked with, and this was actually a recent school district I've worked with. And I first want to say thank you to Gary Bloom, the former superintendent, and the current superintendent, Chris Monroe, at Santa Cruz City School District, who gave me permission to provide this as an example for the work around significant disproportionality. Next slide, please. So just real quickly, Santa Cruz City School District identified for significant disproportionality for black African American students in 12-13 school year. They conducted a root cause analysis, identified various causes, including instructional quality, absence of culturally responsive approaches in educational practice and policy, and inconsistent effect of intervention strategies. Next slide, please. So what Santa Cruz City School District actually did was really pay close attention to these three main areas of what they identified out of their root cause and layered it into their CIS activities. First one being around instructional quality. So the attention to specifically around developing school site tiers of instruction and intervention. And the process that they went through was labor intensive and at times felt as if there were sort of became an iterative process of kind of going back to the tiers of instruction and saying, have we outlined everything that is necessary for us to ensure that we have quality instruction that's made available to all of our kids. They also paid attention to developing the types of observation rubrics that are necessary to ensure that we're following up on that instructional depth. And in particular, which is one of the greatest, I think one of the sort of salient points of what they've done is actually paid attention to how you can monitor that with an equity lens. In a couple of slides, I will show you an example of how they actually put it into their observational tools. The next area in terms of CIS activities was in terms of interventions. They were able to mobilize a set of funding opportunities to hire RTI coordinators at each of their school sites. This actually helped to really catapult their ability to sort of start developing the intervention cycles that had been built out as part of the tiers of instructions, as well as the nature of responsibilities around these RTI coordinators, and translated these intervention strategies over time into core instructional programs. This element of the work, again, similar to the instructional quality, took time. It actually took them a lot longer to kind of really pay attention to what's the best ways in which we can actually ensure that the interventions that we are developing are actually getting us the effect that we desire. And once we learned that, they were able to bring it back to the core instructional program and say, well, how can we leverage this so that now it becomes part of our Tier 1 set of practice? And then lastly, their culture responsive approach. And the way and manner in which they worked on it is obviously sort of having a set of consultants actually coming in and helping them as a district leadership team actually build their competency around this area. In particular, helping them define what is equity for Santa Cruz School District. And in particular, thinking about equity from a three-pronged lens, which is what is our numerical goal, what are our access and opportunity goals, and what are the types of culture and beliefs that we want to promote and the ones that we want to reduce to ensure that we're not replicating this pattern of disproportionality. Next slide, please. So I'm going to now sort of briefly walk you through some of their sample observation tools that were used by the Santa Cruz City School District leaders in infusing an equity lens as part of them practicing what it means for them to continuously own equity as part of the landscape of their instructional leadership and data analysis practice. This example here is one of those areas. One of the target areas that they wanted to pay attention to was what's the landscape of Tier 1 instruction? What's core to our instructional program? And one of the areas that they significantly had spent time on was this notion of productive academic talk, meaning the degree to which kids are having opportunities to actually talk during the span of classroom time, and as well as within that time, what's the quality of that? Are they raising questions? Are they using certain analytical tools during those conversations? Are they responding? Are they initiating? The important element of this particular tool here is it gave the leaders an opportunity to begin observing the degree to which productive academic talk was not only existing within the context of the classroom, but also asking the harder question, which is, who's getting exposure to these productive academic talk opportunities? The leaders took this data and were able to put it into a survey form that allowed for them to generate the data, so they used it for their next staff development to learn, to understand, so what are some of the patterns that emerge from these observations, and how can we retool again our academic talk strategy? Next slide, please. The next tool that they also infused an equity lens around was this collaborative work rubric. Another area of instructional practice that Santa Cruz City School District wanted to pay particular attention to, which is the degree to which is there sufficient amounts of collaborative work that's actually happening in the context of classroom. Again, collaborative work, productive academic talk, all fall under their RTI framework in terms of what they considered core to their instructional program at Tier 1. And so as the leaders were building the practice capacity of their staff to understand what is collaborative work, what does it look like in the context of the classroom, how can we practice it in such a way that making sure that everyone has an opportunity to do it well, and also how can we grow from that collaborative work. In this particular rubric tool that the leaders use was an opportunity for them to actually, again, infuse an equity lens to ask the question, not only is collaborative work actually getting operationalized within the context of the classroom, but who is getting the exposure around that collaborative work? Are we seeing equitable distribution of the nature of that collaborative work that's actually happening within the context of classrooms? So again, this became an opportunity for leaders to give feedback to teachers through an additional lens that, as Santa Cruz School District, as one of various school districts that are really making sure that what they're learning from their root cause process lands in their CIS plans, but also lands as part of their equity commitment as a school district, that they're constantly practicing what does it mean for them to always ask the question of, if we're doing these activities, how are we making sure that all of our kids are getting an equitable exposure in such a way that we're ensuring that we're not going to land with a level of disproportionate representation over time. And so I'll close by saying that Santa Cruz City School District, which having worked with them for over 3 years, this particular school district is no longer identified as significant disproportionate as a school district, and continues to embedding this type of work as just a normalized element of who they are as a school district. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Eddie. We have some time, and we're going to ask that Michael and Nancy, along with Eddie, join us for Q&A. We will also have Phil and Kent on the line. We've got numerous questions throughout the symposium, and we'll try to answer as many of those questions as we can. If you still have a question, please submit it in the Ask a Question box under the Q&A tab near the bottom of your screen. Now I will invite our panelists to come back up. So, back. Our first question: how are states reworking calculations and soliciting feedback from stakeholders? So this is a question that we are very interested in finding out more information about. However, at this time, we do not have a lot of information regarding that. First, because the final rule, obviously, as you know, is still new, and we haven't had a lot of interactions yet with states about this particular process in terms of how they're doing it. I will say that this is exactly the type of question that we will have further opportunities through the shared space for peer-to-peer learning, where we hope that these types of questions will be examined and discussed with states and other stakeholders, as well as OSEP staff and other TA providers. I will ask the panel if they have any insights into the question before we move on, in terms of how states are reworking their calculations. If you've had any interactions with states regarding this question of reworking their calculation and stakeholder engagement.
I could talk about some stakeholder engagement. One state that we've worked with in anticipation of the new regulations began some stakeholder work about 9 months ago, where they convened and trained a group of stakeholders about the MPRM, and so what the proposed requirements were, because they knew they needed to change their processes. So over the period of the last 9 months, they've had 4 stakeholder meetings and are planning the last 2 now that they're a final regs. And they have facilitated and worked really hard to make sure that their stakeholders really understood what the calculations meant, what it would mean to have multiple years of data, what different thresholds would, and the impact and the requirements, and now they're moving forward to get some recommendations actually from the stakeholders.
From my experience in terms of working with various state education departments, what they've been paying attention to is the degree to which they, because this has been part of the, in the water stream of conversation for quite a while, that it provided us an opportunity to actually engage in these dialogues with a variety of groups, right? So in one state, they have been in dialogue with a range of stakeholders around this question of sort of what would it mean for us to have certain thresholds. But more importantly, in one particular state, one of the strategies that they actually had was to actually take this, what we've learned already from around disproportionality, and actually place it as part of their larger statewide accountability conversations period, so that it's not isolated and separate from, but rather embedded within, and it's a constant dialogue. Other states are, now that the final regs have emerged, they are now moving more diligently in terms of really talking specifically around this notion of reasonableness and what it means for them to actually have the right stakeholders at the table, whether community members, advocacy groups, to really lend some thoughts around what it means to be reasonable around the threshold.
Thank you both for sharing that. Those are both key examples that we all need to hear more about. I think one of the other things, lastly, to mention is that Renee mentioned earlier about one of our technical assistance centers, formerly the partnership work and the leading by convening work with respect to stakeholder engagement. That work is now housed within the National Center for Systemic Improvement, and that center will be focusing its effort really to look at how to engage stakeholders in this process as it relates to this rule. So stay tuned for more information. The next question is, does the provision of including 3 to 5-year-olds in the calculation for disproportionality apply to Indicator 5? Indicator 5, for those of you who don't know, they're referring to the Part B placement and educational environment indicator for the annual performance report for school-aged children. The answer to the question is no, that the calculation for 3 to 5-year-old and significant disproportionality only applies to this provision in this particular rule. So, next question looks like this is going to be for Michael. Do we know the date that SEAs will have to report thresholds and standards for reasonable progress? Is it an effective date?
It's not the effective date, no. And the information collection request that is going to set all of these dates and the timeline under the Paperwork Reduction Act is in process.
Thank you. Michael, again, what does it mean for states to be in compliance by July 1st, 2018? And when do states need to make determinations for the first time using their new methods?
Right. I'm going to refer the questioner to the document, to the final rule itself, because we've answered it in great detail, actually twice, on pages 92-378 and 92-392, and the document is in the pre-work material. And so that will give you the answer to both of those questions and rather more. So rather than try and do it justice myself, I'll refer the answer there.
Thank you, Michael. Eddie, this question is for you. I'm planning a study of CEIS used for significant disproportionality. What are some good questions?
That's a great question. I think as state education departments and school districts are paying attention to their CIS plans, a set of good questions that need to be constant in thinking about CIS plans is the goodness of or the connectedness to the root cause analysis. So what we actually identify as the core sets of issues, how are they layered into the CIS plans? And within those plans, what's built in there is what's the wellness to which we're actually outlining the steps or processes that are necessary for those activities to actually occur. So, and you know, there I'm referring to, and I would refer the questioner to actually think about using the tools that are existing in the National Implementation Resource Network that really pay close attention to the idea of what are the drivers and levers that are necessary to ensure that any activity actually has a high level of fidelity, and that we're actually, and most importantly, monitoring the wellness to which we're actually putting them in place. So in order to be able to, to study the CIS, it's a matter of making sure that we're paying attention to the goodness of the fidelity and the wellness of what we're building out.
Thank you, Eddie. And I know we're moving fast, so we want to get to as many questions as possible. Nancy, should the questions on the Success Gaps Toolkit be answered using the lens of the area of non-compliance, i.e. overrepresentation of black students in emotional disturbance only, or considering practices in genetic?
Both. The answer, I could be real succinct, but the answer is absolutely. You want to keep your focus area in mind, but also you want to look at what is happening in education for all children and how the group you're working with is fitting into that and is being a part of that.
Thank you. Michael, this looks like a question for you. Are there other disproportionality metrics an SEA could use in addition to the risk ratio?
Well, the regulations require that the determinations of significant disproportionality be made with the risk ratio. There's nothing that prevents a state from using other methods for their own internal purposes and to inform themselves, say for a root cause analysis or whatever other reason the state might have whatever other issues the state might want to explore. But the determination itself must be made using the standard methodology.
Thank you. Here's a question. If we could invest in only one thing to reduce disproportionality in suspension and expulsion, what would it be? I'm going to call on Phil for this question. Actually, he provided the answer, and I will read it. Coaching for providers on evidence-based prevention practices, including data collection and use. Kent says that measuring disproportionality regularly, using data to identify problems and monitor progress. Those are the answers. Next, question for Eddie. How can we ensure that as we address disproportionality, we remain committed to addressing all student needs?
That's a great question. One of the opportunities that arise out of significant disproportionality is an opportunity for school districts and for state education departments to ask the question around the wellness of what they had planned to do as part of the instructional plan, as part of their behavioral plan, as part of their school culture plan, is the degree to which there is goodness to it. Did we do it the way we planned for it to actually occur? And when we didn't, how can we improve on it to ensure that it's not only affecting all of our students, but more particularly, it's actually having the types of improved effect with the populations that are experiencing disproportionate effect. So in ensuring sort of that there is success, it's making sure that that our priority is around all students, but with a particular attention to the populations of students who we know are in the most vulnerable set of conditions that unless we as practitioners actually have a priority around, we could potentially lose sight if we don't also put them at the center of that examination.
Thank you. Nancy, is success gap something that I would only use if my LEA was identified as having significant disproportionality?
Absolutely not. There are actually, and we didn't focus on those today, but there are many reasons a district or a school could use the success gaps to look at some equity or success gaps issues. But also, as we talked about today, even if a district has not yet been identified, but maybe has met the threshold or is approaching the threshold for 1 or more years, you may want to use that tool as a real proactive, preventative kind of tool to to identify reasons that you may be seeing disproportionality.
Thank you. To that, I'm going to stay with you, Nancy. If I'm a principal in a school and not an LEA, could I use the Success Gaps tool in my school?
That's also a great question. And yes, we feel that the Success Gaps tool is very effective at the school level to identify differences and outcomes among groups of students within your school. It's, again, the leader of the school and the stakeholder team can use that very effectively in a school setting.
Thank you. This looks like a question for Michael. What are the major differences between voluntary CEIS and comprehensive CEIS?
Sure. Comprehensive CEIS is required. It's a statutory remedy required upon a finding of significant disproportionality. Voluntary CEIS is voluntary. There's significant difference in the populations served. Comprehensive CEIS can serve children with disabilities and can serve preschool children ages 3 to 5. Funds reserved for voluntary CEIS cannot. And the third significant difference is that the regulations require comprehensive CEIS to be used in a way to address the factors contributing to significant disproportionality. There is no such statutory requirement for voluntary CEIS, even though it's likely to be used that way as a matter of practice.
Thank you. I would also add to that, if I may, that one other difference is the amount of the percentage of funding used with requirement in comprehensive CEIS is 15% for a finding of significant disproportionality, and as with voluntary CEIS, an LEA can use up to
Correct.
15%. Next question. Nancy, how can success gaps be used in a district with persistent significant disproportionality?
So just sounds like we're talking about a district that has had significant disproportionality over multiple years, and so certainly we hope that they've already been addressing or trying to address their significant disproportionality. They've been using CEIS funds, but you could use the Success Gaps tool to really dig deeper, get really down to that practice level, look at, again, it's the idea of a process that has a representative stakeholder team that is really delving into the practices, and together you're identifying which of our practices are actually not meeting the needs of all of the students, and using it that way to kind of really keep digging deeper into the data and the practices.
For Eddie, how can the methodology be aligned or closely connected to root cause processes?
So I think one of the beauties around sort of as we think about methodology, but aside from the mechanics of it and or the technical aspects of the methodology and that state education departments are going to do, what's important is to understand that it's one part of obviously sort of the identification, but it's also a great tool for the thinking in regards as a thinking tool within the root cause process as well. So the opportunity that state education departments have, especially now given that the regs have a discussion around stakeholders, that it provides an opportunity for stakeholders to also learn from what the methodology provides us a leverage to be able to say that if we have patterns of policy, practice, or procedural gaps, then it should be affecting everyone proportionally, but this methodology is telling us that there may be patterns of disproportionate representation while these gaps are existing. And I think that's, as I find in a lot of the work that I do with state education departments and school districts, is that is such a fruitful exercise of really thinking through that there's much more that is actually happening here beyond just the, are we using the right methodology, but rather, what is it beginning to indicate for us in terms of our process?
Thank you. Michael, what do you do with small states that have N sizes of 1 or 2?
there are a number of questions sort of packed in there, and I'll try and tease some of them out. I spoke about the presumptively reasonable n sizes and cell sizes and n sizes of 10 and 30. That is up to 10 and up to 30. So first, there's nothing that prevents a state from using a small cell size like that, right? And that's entirely up to the state's discretion. If it's reasonable in the state's particular circumstances to do that, it should do that. The effect of having a small cell size, right, is that more districts get included in the significant disproportionality analysis, including the districts with small populations, and so you increase, in effect, the chance of having some volatile results.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to stay with you, Michael. Did one of the presenters say we have the flexibility to flag LEAs as significant disproportionate, not annually, if we use the multiple years of data? For example, we could flag LEAs using 3 years of data, then they hold CEIS funds for 3 years, then do the same thing again?
Yeah, and that's not quite what I was saying, or not quite what I was trying to say, so thank you for clarifying. What I was trying to say was that the state has the flexibility of basing its significant disproportionality determination on 1, 2, or 3 years, 3 prior years of data. So you're going to do an analysis every year, and it's merely that your determination may take into consideration the data from years before the one immediately prior. Right? So, for example, if my data, if I am above the risk ratio threshold in, let's call it, the second year before the current, but not in the third and not in the first, I don't in that year need to make a determination of significant disproportionality if I have a 3-year data look back. That's what I was trying to articulate.
Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up. Nancy, can states conduct data dives into the interconnectedness of categories that states must consider significant disproportionality, i.e., our same cohort of kids over-identified for disability placed in more restrictive environments and subjected to discipline?
Absolutely, you can do that. The Success Gaps tool is a great tool to look at multiple aspects of the data at one time. It'll be important that you have the data to look at that, and so as the district leaders are preparing for the Success Gap work, they need to bring the data that will support the team to look further, and then again you have to think about the makeup of your team so you have the right people at the table to help look at all the factors that you're talking about.
Thank you. That actually concludes the questions that we have time for today to answer. If your question did not get answered in the live session, we have them all and hope to answer many more in our post-workspace and other upcoming activities as we continue to support states in this process. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time, and I'd like to thank all of our presenters, all of you participating and listening out, and thank you all just for joining us for our first event of the 2017 Symposia Series. Late next week, we will be sending you additional information on how you can participate in the post-event discussion opportunities. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.